thank you all for joining today. My name is Sam. I am a creative lead here at ReadWords, and I'm joined by Orla.
Hi everyone, I'm Orla. I'm also a creative lead at ReadWords.
And today we're going to be talking to you about building brands through language. First of all, why that matters, why language is important for brands and becoming ever more important. And then we'll turn our attention to the specific challenges that ethical brands face and the way that they should be thinking about language to make sure that they stand out, that they're consistent, and that they're kind of recognizable in an increasingly busy space. So this is us. We'll tell you a little bit more about ourselves in a few slides' time. How this session is going to work is you'll notice we have put you on mute as you join the call. If you could stay on mute, that would be great. It will help us kind of cut out all that frequency noise. We're going to talk for around 20-25 minutes. At the end, we'll hopefully have some time for some questions. So as we go, please do drop in your questions in the chat. And we'd love to answer as many as possible, from strategic questions to practical questions about how you start a brand language project through to the nitty-gritty stuff of everyday writing. We'd like to try and answer anything and everything. So please do drop those things in. So what we're going to talk about is, first of all, why we're here, why an agency like ours can exist, which is why brand language matters. Then we're going to move on to some ways to start thinking about your brand language. We're conscious that sometimes it can feel like a slightly nebulous project or process to get started. So we want to give you some kind of first steps to take. We'll then look at some practical ways that you can start building that brand language and start making it into something that comes to life in your brand and your experience, but that your teams, your colleagues, the freelance copywriters that you hire, they can also take that language on and start writing in it. And then finally, we'll turn to what this means specifically for ethical brands and the sorts of different challenges and things that they have to think about. So a little bit about us before we get started. So we're ReadWords. We're a brand writing agency based in London and Manchester. We are a relatively small team of mostly writers, and we think that's the best way for a writing agency to work, in that it means that clients get to work directly with writers and we don't have lots of complicated layers in between the client and the work that's happening. And we do all sorts of different brand language disciplines, from big strategic things like verbal identity and brand strategy, where we figure out what a brand is about, why it's here, and what that means for the language it uses. So both messaging, the kind of what the brand is saying, and the tone, the style, the how it's saying it. Obviously, as you can imagine, lots of digital, from content strategy to UX writing, copywriting, which is our way of talking about everything from film scripts to packaging, and then naming, where we find new names for new brands or rename old brands or products. So we think it's a really nice mix of things, and it kind of keeps us on our toes as writers, as do our range of clients, ranging from some very big global names to some slightly smaller ones. Again, we think it's a nice mix, and keeps us kind of flexible and agile as writers. There are a couple of ethical brands up here like Bulb and UpCircle. We'll talk more about our specific experience on that as we go through. So that's enough about us for the moment. Moving on to why we're here today and how brands can start building themselves through language. Well, the first thing we want to talk about is why this matters, why brands should pay attention to this at all. And really, the first thing to say is that, well, they have always had to do this. Language has always been a powerful tool for brands. It has always helped audiences understand, is this brand useful and relevant to me? Can I see a role for it in my day-to-day? Can I trust it? Is it good at what it's doing? Is it credible? Is it authentic? If it tells me that it's the best place for my groceries or my energy bill, do I believe it? That's always been true for as long as brands have been using language, for as long as they've been around. What is changing, and I think changing at ever greater pace, is that brands are now having to use language more than ever. They're having to use it in more channels and moments and experiences than ever before. And they're also expected to talk about so many more different things, which I suppose in one way is an opportunity for brands, because it means they have more language to play with, so more opportunity to tell the world about themselves. But there's also some potential risks and pitfalls there, in that you're no longer just managing a relatively small number of channels, you're managing a huge range, and language is very slippery and can kind of trip you up if you're not paying attention. So in the old days, 50, 60 years ago, brands had a few channels in which language was really important, like ads and packaging and direct mail. which means someone like Coca-Cola, that famous ethical brand, they would have ad campaigns that they would run, a few times a year, and they would have body copy. They might have some direct mail, they'll have the packaging copy. But beyond that, there wasn't really much opportunity for them in terms of language, which, good and bad, meant that they weren't going to trip up, but equally they possibly weren't having all the opportunities to tell the world about themselves. Now it's a totally different situation, and it's changing all the time. We still have those kind of core traditional channels, but now we have live chat where you're kind of creating or trying to train a group of people to use your language and use your voice, through to apps, through to blogs, recruitment. The channels keep on growing all the time. So yes, someone like Coca-Cola still has its kind of big glossy advertising campaigns, but it also has complex digital experiences where it's trying to guide the user from A to B, and it's trying to do that in a way that still feels Coca-Cola, and that it reassures the user that they're still in that brand space. They're having to obviously talk directly to consumers in a way that they never had before. This is a slightly frivolous tweet about what happens, or why do Coca-Cola cans explode when they come out of the vending machine, but Coca-Cola have to respond, and they have to do it in a way that kind of meets the customer and thinks about what they're looking for, but also feels kind of authentic and true to what Coca-Cola is about. And as we discovered last year, brands are having to talk about big kind of historic moments. I imagine there was nothing in the Coca-Cola guidelines that would prepare them to talk about COVID, but it's a big brand, it's an enormous situation, and so they're expected to say something. That needs to work again for the mood. It needs to feel empathetic, but it also needs to feel true to Coca-Cola. So that the clearer idea of your language, that the better able you are to meet these sorts of situations. So that is really a way of saying that a lot of the time when we see people talk about brand language, it tends to focus on those most visible kind of high frequency moments, your homepage, your ad campaign, your social channels. Those things are all absolutely essential, of course, and absolutely need to be at the heart of any brand language process. But really, if it's anywhere near your logo, if it's coming from your brand, if it's a customer email to terms and conditions, then it needs to have the same amount of consideration and love and care as everything else, because otherwise you end up with a kind of a half-finished job and a very kind of inconsistent voice and brand language. So how do you start doing all that? What are the first sort of steps you should take to find that brand language and to find something that feels true to your brand? Well, I'm going to hand over to Orlaith, and she'll take us through some ways to think about your brand language.
Thanks, Sam. So yeah, we've narrowed this down to the 3 biggest questions that you need to ask of your brand language when you start thinking about this stuff. The first one is it authentic? So does your language sound true to your brand? The second one is it recognizable? So can people pick you out from a crowd by looking at the language you use? And the third one is it consistent? Are you speaking in the same voice everywhere you communicate? So let's take those one by one. The first one, is it authentic? So does it feel right for the brand, or does it feel like it's a superficial layer that you've sort of spread on top to give a certain impression? This is one that we notice big brands often get wrong. So if we look at this example from Lloyds Bank, you might remember these ads that they did a couple of years ago. In terms of content, the copy here is obviously very progressive, and tonally, it's very simple, it's emotional, it's human language. This is really good stuff. It's really engaging. It brings people into the brand. But then if we look at something that's a bit more sort of nitty gritty, when we get into the engine room of the brand, like the terms and conditions, for example, we can see that this voice, this language starts to break down, and it's almost like a curtain's been lifted, and everything that they had invested in that sort of shop front of their brand has been undermined, because they're starting to use language like, if you've been grossly negligent, and security details stolen, it's really cold, it's really formal. And what's happening here is that we don't know who Lloyds is. Are they this warm, friendly human brand, or are they this stiff, formal, convoluted brand? And when we don't know, then we can't trust them, because they're so different. These voices are both so different. And you might think, it's impossible to write this sort of nitty-gritty terms and conditions copy in a way that is warm and friendly, but it's actually not. We've had a go here of rewriting this. So if your security details have been lost or stolen, it's important to let us know straight away. Otherwise, we can't refund any money taken from your account. So, it's just small changes to this copy, but it's really elevated the language. And it's really important not to forget this sort of nitty-gritty copy when you're thinking about your brand language, because it's this stuff that could really make the biggest difference. This is the stuff that people are going to really engage with your brand. So is it recognizable? The second point we need to think about. So is it easy to identify? Do people know it's you from your language? And are the tone and content working together to define your brand? Are they doing you a favor? Are they helping you be more recognizable to your customers? So we've got a little exercise here, which we'd love if you could get involved with. We've got 5 descriptions of oat milks, which you might be familiar with, and we've got the 5 brand names there at the top left. So if you wanted to drop into the chat which one you think is which, so they're not in order. So can you guess which one's Oatly, which one's MoMA, which one's Alpro, and which one's Califia, and which one's Minor Figures? And I'll read them out one by one. So heads up, here comes the oats, and they're coming straight your way. Our oat drink is a great source of plant fiber. One taste and you'll know our oats are outstanding. The second one is, you can't milk an oat. We learned that the hard way. But you can get a delicious, nutritious, and incredibly versatile drink from one if you know your oats like we do. So which one do you think that is? Then the third one is, our original oat drink is a great go-to product for just about everything and would make other drinks exceptionally jealous. But since it is made of oats and oats are incredibly humble, well, then jealousy is just not an issue. Which one's that? And then number 4 is, better for your coffee, better for the planet. Our oat milk is formulated by baristas for baristas. Our goal is not to compromise the fidelity of your coffee in the cup. And finally, the last one, smooth, naturally creamy, and right at home in your kitchen. Our oat milk is so versatile, you'll drink it faster than you can spell O-A-T. So we've got some guesses in the chat here. So we think 4 might be Oatly, okay. 1 MoMA, 4 Minor Figures. Second one could be Oatly as well. So it's quite hard really, isn't it, to tell these guys apart. They all sound a little bit similar, but I think most people are saying 2 is Oatly, 4 is Minor Figures. Okay, let's see. So on the next slide, have we lost? Can everyone else still see? Yeah, we can still see the screen. So these are the answers. So Oatly is actually number 3. But I think what's quite interesting about this and why it's sort of unclear which one is Oatly is because some of the other guys have started to copy their sort of playful tone, which, we see happen a lot. But when people like Alpro try to do this, it sort of feels a bit superficial, a bit like they're just layering it on top because they're this big corporate business. And when they have this playful tone, it just feels a bit sort of dad jokey, I think. So that proves basically that imitation doesn't really work when it comes to this point, which goes back to the previous point. Your voice and your language has to be authentic. You can't just adopt a personality that doesn't fit at all with your brand. And Minor Figures is an interesting one as well. They're not going down the playful route. They've got quite a serious tone of voice, which I think works for them because that's their whole thing, is about being about seriously good coffee, right? And their voice reflects that mood. And I think Oatly is a really interesting example, but they didn't always look like this. They didn't always use copy in this way to really stand out and to build their brand. They actually used to look like this, which I think is really interesting. Back when they launched in 2012, it's in terms of copy, in terms of language, it's dull, it's conventional, it's very apologetic. You wouldn't be surprised, it just blends into the rest of the stuff on the shelf. And actually what they did at Oatly was they completely got rid of their marketing department so that they were sort of more free to be agile and more creative with their ads, which is what led to the stuff that we're seeing today and the big ballsy ad lines, like it's like milk but made for humans. I think the only reason that it's possible for them to do that is because they don't have those, people at the top saying you can't do that, it's too risky. And obviously, you know, that got them in a bit of trouble. They did get sued by the Swedish milk lobby, but even then they managed to sort of turn that into an opportunity. They put it all online, they put the entire lawsuit online, which helped them gain loads of fans in the process. And I think the company revenues like gone from like 40 million to like 400 million or something since they sort of revamped the brand and turned it into this, which really does go to show, you know, the power of a strong brand language. It shows you what it can do, and Oatly's a great example of a strong copy-led brand. But then it's important to say that, you know, you might not necessarily need to be as distinctive and in your face as Oatly when it comes to your language. Sometimes it's enough just to be recognizable. And that will very much depend on the type of brand or product or service that you're launching or that you're running. An example of this is Penhaligon's perfume, which we did the tone of voice for. Penhaligon's is a British perfumery. It's very sort of eccentric, it's over the top. And you know, the voice reflects that, because that's what people expect, and that's what people want from an eccentric British brand. They want something with loads of personality. Whereas, you know, if we look at someone like Bulb, the energy supplier, they don't necessarily need to be distinctive. It's enough for them to just be simple and human and clear, because, you know, when they launched especially, that really did set them apart from their competitors like British Gas. And that's what mattered. You know, they needed to look different. They didn't need to look wacky. People didn't want gags from their energy supplier. But it does show that being recognizable is a good way to stand out. You just don't have to push it too far if you don't need to. And then finally, is it consistent? So, you know, this can be quite hard to manage, especially if you're managing a large brand, but it's definitely something you need to keep an eye on, in the same way as you need to keep an eye on your visual brand. You'd have guidelines for that. You don't want your brand to become fuzzy if you're showing up differently in how you communicate in different places. A great example of this is Nike. So you can tell that this is a Nike ad, even though it doesn't have a logo on it. And that's because their voice is so distinctive, it's active, it's aggressive almost. You know, these instructions that they put in their ads, it's almost as recognizable in terms of tone as the tick is. Then it starts to break. If we look again into the engine room of the brand, in this case, it's a delayed order email. You know, this voice completely falls apart. It reverts to formal, stiff language, you know, phrases like, "We apologize for any inconvenience caused." And even the sign off, "sincerely." Is there any word in the English language that sounds less like Nike than the word sincerely? I don't think so. And the result of this for Nike's customers is that they've bought into this brand that's super cool, super aggressive through the ads. And then they've been completely let down once they've actually bought something. And that inconsistency is a real issue, because in Nike's case, it destroys the coolness of the brand, and it destroys the trust that people have in the brand. So this is where, again, language can make a real difference. So just to recap then, 3 main questions to ask of your brand language: is it authentic? Is it recognizable? And is it consistent? And I'm going to hand back over to Sam, who's going to take you through some practical tips for building your brand language.
Super, thanks, Orla. Okay, so let's get practical. So first things first, if you're running a brand at the moment, you're using language at the moment, then the first thing to do is to assess what impression you're giving off. And to do that, it's all about gathering as many different examples as possible. So yes, the ads, yes, the social channels, but the in-app push notifications, the T's and C's, put that all out on the table and then read it out loud and ask yourself, well, does this all sound consistent? Does it feel like it's all coming from the same brand? Or do my customer emails sound different to my tweets, for example? If it does sound consistent, then great. But then what impression am I giving off? Am I sounding fun and energetic and enthusiastic, or slightly cooler and more reserved? And once you've figured out whether there are those gaps to fill in, or whether those impressions aren't quite working for your brand, that will give you a foundation to move on with. And as part of that process, I'd really focus on the moments that from a kind of brand level might not seem the most interesting, but from a customer level, they're probably the moments that your customers see the most often. So let's think about the Amazon customer order email, for example. Amazon, another great ethical hero. This email is probably the most widely received email in the world. It's something that we see all the time. As a bit of brand language, it feels pretty flat to me. You know, there's a real opportunity here to express more about the Amazon brand. The fact that they're not doing that maybe tells you something about the way they view their brand. But for another brand, the moment your customer receives that order confirmation is a real moment of kind of delight and satisfaction for them. And so the more you can do with your language, the better you are able to express it. So even these little micro moments that sometimes go missing from branding processes can be really powerful for your language. So once you've gathered those samples and once you've started to analyze how the language is working, the important thing is to think about, is this working for my brand or is it working against it? So whatever your brand positioning is, let's say it's about revolutionizing finance, does the language reinforce it or does it undermine it? If you're about revolution finance, do you sound kind of sharp and energetic and modern, or do you sound as kind of stuffy and conservative and expected, as we saw that Lloyd's copy at the beginning? If the language isn't working, then that's something you need to have a think about. We spotted this nice example a couple of years ago from Revolut, who are a fintech startup based in London, whose sort of brand position is all about demystifying finance and stripping out the complexity and making it more accessible for people. And they did a really nice exercise where they said, well, if our language is all about simplicity, then our terms and conditions, which famously are usually very complicated and written in a way that doesn't work for anyone. Nobody reads terms and conditions. Well, if our brand positioning is about stripping out complexity, then our terms and conditions should be super easy to read. So they went through and rewrote them, and now they're much more accessible, which just feels like a nice way of kind of demonstrating your brand promise and kind of putting it into action. And then finally, and I think hardest of all, is there will come a point where after you've done the kind of analysis and you've talked with colleagues and co-founders and whoever about what sort of language you should use, it's time to then put it down on the page. And this is a really tricky moment because it's easy to talk about language and it's harder to kind of pin it down. The easiest way to do that is just to test it out with kind of practical examples of writing. So the way that we approach this at Read Words is to start off with the kind of strategic stuff and then get into the practical things as quickly as possible. So this is a kind of glimpse at the work that we did for Shoe a couple of years ago. Shoe, for those of you who don't know, the kind of footwear trainer sneaker store. They have a very kind of offbeat, slightly left field kind of brand positioning, which you can see in lines like this: by the people, for the feet. You know, they're meant to be a little bit quirky and unusual. How do you bring that to life in language? Well, you write the tone of voice guidelines. This is the kind of the opening page, and you start off with something like the kind of foundation for the voice, which is weirdly relatable. Weird because they're meant to be unusual and provocative and interesting and eye-catching. Relatable because, well, they're a high street brand and that they want to be, able to talk to as many different customers as possible. They want everyone to feel like they can come into Shoe and be part of the brand. So those two things to come together to create the foundation for the voice. But then how do you actually make that happen? Well, you put together some practical writing tips like this. This is only the first page, but you can see things like write how you chat and be honest, don't exaggerate. Start to give the writer, the social media manager, the freelancer, whoever is writing on behalf of the brand, it starts to give them the practical tools they need to bring it to life. And then you show them what it looks like in action. And it really is the examples of a voice, or the examples of brand language that I think are most useful. This is always the section I turn to whenever I'm given a new voice guidelines. So here we have a newsletter sign up, which is a really small moment, but is an opportunity for the brand. Previously, it sounded pretty perfunctory: sign up for news, email sign up. That's it. That could be any brand in the world, really. Whereas now it feels much more Shoe. Exclusive offers and style news straight to your inbox. Shoe in. Just a small moment that expresses the brand more vividly. And then it goes through as many different examples as you possibly can find, as many different channels and audiences. This is a customer service stat, which again could be quite a kind of flat moment for the brand. It's elevated, it's made more interesting and more Shoe in the rewrite. So that really is the way to start building your brand languages. Yes, you've got to do the talking up front and figure out the strategy and then make it as practical and useful as possible. Okay, before we move on to questions, I'm going to hand back to Orla, who is going to talk to us about what this all means for ethical brands and some specific challenges that we have when it comes to language.
Thanks, Sam. So the first point here is to keep it grounded. And what we mean by this is that you need to not be trading in big abstract ideas. I'm sure you're all same as I am fed up with phrases like save the planet or help the environment, because they don't really help anyone. They make the problems sound too big to fix. And the key point here is to try and remember that not everyone that you engage with is going to be motivated by your purpose. So you need to meet them on their level instead. And you can do that by relating your purpose to your audience's lived experience. So thinking about social benefits instead of big abstract ideas. So for example, if you're an organization that's trying to combat climate change, how can we frame that in a way that's really specific and human and gets on people's level? It might be talking about flooding in coastal communities in the UK. It's these sort of real, tangible, practical benefits that feel close to home that are going to sort of engage people and win people over. And a really good example of that is Mums for Lungs. I don't know if you're aware of this. It's a campaign group set up by a group of mums in South London who are campaigning for cleaner air quality. And because of the language they use, Mums for Lungs will always win, because anyone that goes up against them is basically saying it's okay to poison kids' lungs, right? Because their main point is that they don't want this air quality to be damaging the health of their kids, and you just can't argue with that. And they come out with posters on the next slide that are just they're not filled with stats or complex science. It's just simple real life human facts, like cars make us sick. And we think they're doing a really good job of framing things in this human, practical, tangible way. The second challenge to think about is show, don't tell, which might sound quite obvious. It's a bit sort of marketing 101, I know, but it is extra important for ethical and sustainable brands, because especially when it comes to stuff that has a higher purpose, people really don't like being told what to do. So you can't just hit people around the head with your message. And instead, how can you have an effect? It's by using a story where your consumer is the protagonist. So if you can show someone that are engaging with your product or service, they're showing how easy it is, they're showing how it makes their life better, then that gives people the agency to come up with their own ideas, so that they can say, I saw this thing and I thought it was great and I think I can do it. So then they can do it, and then they can show their friends that they're doing it, and they can show off a little bit. And it's important not to underestimate how much people do like to do that, to discover something and then to be able to tell people about it. And yeah, if you can do that in a more subtle way than just telling them they should, that can be really effective. An example of this is Quorn, who obviously use Olympians in their ads, just to try and persuade people to use corn instead of meat a couple of days a week. They're showing it's healthy, and if Olympians can do it, then I can do it. It makes it look easy and healthy, and why not give it a go? And then finally, don't preach. I think unfortunately, as ethical and sustainable people in business, you've still got a lot of work to do to shake off this kind of preconceived notion that anything to do with caring about people or the planet is like inherently worthy. And a lot of this, again, stems from people not liking being told what to do. So instead of sort of trying to make people feel guilty that they're not doing the right thing, it's just about focusing on the benefits, giving them, again, real tangible benefits that relate to their lives. And steering well clear of a kind of preachy or worthy tone, because it just won't resonate. Instead, like, who gives a crap? You can find your own personality. You can balance your serious mission with a really unserious tone. Who gives a crap is all about toilet humor and making the world a better place, which is a really nice juxtaposition. And we see a lot of brands having this kind of more cheeky, playful tone. This is one we worked on recently. It's the Do-Gooders rebrand. It's now called Goodfind, which is a directory where you can find ethical alternatives to products and services. And they've got this really nice, cheeky, rebellious, no bullshit tone, which makes these life decisions sound easy, not big and scary. And it's really in your face, and definitely not that kind of worthy, preachy voice that might have been more common in the past. And it's a great way to talk about big issues without taking yourself too seriously. So just to recap that, the three biggest challenges that we've identified, obviously there's a whole load of other stuff we could have talked about today, but in terms of finding the right brand voice and brand language for an ethical and sustainable brand, our top tips would be to keep it grounded, show, don't tell, and don't preach. So I think we've had some questions in the chat already. Let me scroll back. Kavitha had a question about when you're a solopreneur business, how do you go about deciding whether to use the first person or third person when it comes to like your website and your social media? I think that's a really good question, Kavitha, answer that. I think you should always use the third person. You should use we, because it makes it sound bigger. It's always good to position yourself as like something bigger than you are. But at the same time, your founder story is really important to your brand, and there's definitely a place for that as well. So I think, you know, if you can bring that in through like a founder's story section on your website or on your social media, you might have like a personal sign off on some of your tweets and then use the third person for other ones so that it feels like there's a team, but people know when they're hearing directly from you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I just agree with that. Or I think absolutely. I think that, you know, I suppose the ambition for any brand is to become bigger and to start living by itself. So using we and pretending that the brand is a group of people, I think is a nice thing to do, even as you're starting off as an individual. But absolutely, a kind of individual voice can be really powerful in a way of kind of talking about slightly different things, or your experiences as an entrepreneur. Those are all really interesting themes that your brand can use without having to come explicitly from the brand.
Okay, the reason I asked that question is because I've been told that if we use we rather than I, then it's not authentic enough because there is nobody other than me behind the brand. So it's that authenticity versus trying to grow versus, you know, and most of us have been trained to write in we in third person. Writing in I is quite difficult. So it's that balancing act that I'm trying to do that I'm not doing very well at the moment.
It would probably be, again, if we look at Oatly, if you can look into that a bit more and look at how they use their founder, in terms, obviously, like they're much bigger now, but I think they do a really good job of like personifying the brand around their CEO Tony a little bit, but not letting him like take over everything, if you know what I mean. But I just think, yeah, you have to be bold and go for it. One day you're going to be massive, right? So just be confident and go for it. Daniela had a question about how you can define your brand language when you don't have a brand strategy to start with.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a position that some of our clients come to us in, so that you wouldn't be the only one or the first brand to do that. And I think sometimes language is a useful way of figuring out that strategy. So, you know, how do you do, say, customer emails, for example? If you're breaking bad news to a customer because a product isn't going to arrive on time, do you do that like a cold and formal way, or do you do that in a warmer, kind of more empathetic way? If it's about being warm and empathetic, well, that tells you something about the brand and the way you want to appear to the outside world. So I don't think it's it would be better to have a really clear brand strategy, but it's not absolutely essential because it doesn't stop you just getting into the language and writing different things and figuring out the right voice for your brand. So yes, I don't think it should necessarily hold you back.
Yeah, exactly. It's all connected at the end of the day, isn't it?
And I think also, just to add, sometimes we see a brand strategy that may not be that useful for language. It may be so abstract that it works at a very kind of strategic level, but then as a copywriter, you're left kind of scratching your head and saying, okay, what does this mean for my customer email? What does this mean for, you know, my tweets? And I think that's where a brand language or a tone of voice project can be really useful, because it bridges the gap between very high level strategy stuff into like practical real world examples.
Mm-hmm. Let's try and squeeze another couple more in. I know we said this would just be half an hour, but Jack had a question on producing messaging guidelines for teams who aren't used to copywriting. How much is too much information and what's the right level of guidance? I know this is something that we've talked about as well. It's
that's a really well, Orla, I mean, why don't you go first and then I'll
think sometimes, yeah, it's like you need almost two types of guidelines. You need like a basic guide, and then you need like a power user guide. So for people that aren't necessarily going to be doing the marketing copy, they might not need as much personality. It really depends on your brand as well. But sometimes just a bit of like basic, simple, good writing advice is really useful for your whole team to have. and then you can get into more detail. You like you say, there is too much information can be a thing sometimes. You don't want to drown people in technical stuff if they're not used to dealing with it. But a base level is important for everyone in a business to have. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think in terms of people not feeling comfortable with copywriting and it not feeling like it's something that's part of their day to day, the guidelines can only be the first step. You know, the PDF is useful because it gives everyone a kind of a place to refer back to, but that's where training comes in and workshops and kind of regular meetings to look at copy. I think it is possible to train people to become better writers, but yes, a PDF, the guidelines document, isn't going to do that by itself.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, maybe one more and then we might have to dash off. Let's see. I really love whimsical copy that uses outlandish metaphors. How do you find the balance of keeping it grounded and informative while also being playful? That's a really good question. I think it's probably a case of like knowing when to tone it down and when to turn the volume up on the playfulness, and making sure it doesn't get in the way of the message, because that will just get on people's nerves. I'm not like, I wish I could give you the sort of like mathematical equation for how to get this right, but it really is often just a case of using your own discretion. But some basic rules about, you know, nobody wants whimsical and outlandish metaphors in like a customer service response, or maybe the terms and conditions is just maybe outlining the channels where you're going to be super playful and the ones where you're not, where you're just going to keep it simple and informative.
Yeah, I think I would totally agree with that. And I think really think about your own experience as a customer. As Orla says, there are moments when you're kind of in the mood for more whimsical stuff like Instagram or homepages, product descriptions, like Penhaligon's, for example. The product descriptions are whimsical and the language is full of flourishes. But then there are moments when you'll just want it to be very transactional and very functional, you know, newsletter signups or kind of checkout. You know, there are moments when you just want to get something done, where, as Orla says, that the language has to take a step back and just become all around clarity and being useful rather than getting in the way of what someone wants to do.
Mm-hmm. Great. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. And yes, just to answer somebody else's question, we will be putting the recording of this on our YouTube channel, and we'll email that around to you soon. And in the meantime, please follow us on Twitter at Read Words, sign up to our newsletter if you want to hear more about what we're up to. And yeah, get in touch if there is anything else that we didn't quite get to cover in the questions section. We'd love to hear from you and we'd love to be able to help you. So thanks very much.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for your time.